Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. So, Peter, within a few days, we are coming up to the 80th anniversary of Japan's surrender in World War II. And the story of Japan's surrender is really one of the last myths. Well, maybe there are many other myths, but the World War II has given rise to a great deal of myths, and we're still trying to disentangle the myths. But one of the greatest myths of World War II was that it was the dropping of the two atomic bombs on Japan that caused Japan to surrender. The Japanese realized, wow, there's these gaijin, these barbarians, they've come up with this horrific, nightmarish, terrible weapon. We have to surrender. The problem is that the historical record doesn't bear that out.
Not nearly.
Um, for several obvious reasons. One of which is that the atomic bombs didn't do that much more damage than the complete carpet
Firebombing.
bombing that Japan had been subjected to for the past 6 months. I mean, it wasn't just the Tokyo firebombing, but every other city. I mean, just about everything, was destroyed by the Americans. I mean, they had complete freedom of the air. They could just destroy everything.
The
And
Enola Gay, everyone, the plane that it was actually named after the pilot's mother, Enola Gay. They flew solo. They had no
Yep.
escort to confirm what George is saying. Complete freedom of movement, and a single plane carrying that atomic weapon flew over
That's
Hiroshima
right. That's right. That's right.
unchallenged.
Unchallenged. And the truth is that most governments through history, and most governments, and particularly the Japanese government, really don't care very much about civilian life. I mean, it's just not one of the things that they are worried about. And so that wouldn't have caused the Japanese to sue for peace. That, oh,
To
well,
to to
100,000
to
people have been killed here. Okay, well, that's
to reinforce that point, we know from documentation within the Japanese government they were not moved. They were not moved.
they will not move. So the question then is, well, what did move Japan? Well, what moved Japan was that the Soviet Union entered the war as they had promised at Yalta, that they would enter after the war in Europe had come to an end. So the Soviet Union essentially abrogated the neutrality treaty that Japan and the Soviet Union had signed in the spring of 1941. And this put paid to several ideas on the part of the Japanese. First of all, they were hoping to use the Soviet Union as a mediator. They were still planning to bargain something with the Allied powers, and they thought, well, we've had 4 years of neutrality. Maybe we can use Stalin to mediate, so that we could still get something out of this war. So that put an end to that. But more seriously, the Kwantung Army in Manchuria had been destroyed by the Red Army. And more seriously, even than that, was the Red Army had invaded South Sakhalin and was therefore poised to invade Japan. So up until then, I mean, the Japanese were thinking, yes, the United States is planning to invade, but they weren't sure that the Americans were really going to go through with it, because now, because of the scale of the casualties that the Americans would sustain. So they didn't think they had to worry about that, at least for a few months, about an American invasion. This was direct. This was boom. They were already on Sakhalin Island, and therefore this Red Army invasion was imminent. And so therefore that's what accelerated their desire. And they said, yeah, now we really have to end the war. But what is so important is that why this whole story that the Americans put out after World War II, it was actually quite flattering to the Americans. Yeah, it was cruel, brutal, horrible, monstrous to attack civilians, but America doesn't really care about that. Yeah, they just shows, hey, you see what we are, we're tough guys. That's what we do. That's what we do. So don't mess with us. We did it. We're ready to do it again. So that it added a certain frisson to the American psyche, even though lots of moralists have been writing, oh, this is monstrous and horrible. Japan was already willing to surrender. Why? What was the need to kill these civilians? Yeah, all good arguments, but ultimately, it only added to the cachet of America as the power that brooks no nonsense and is willing to use force ruthlessly, brutally in order to get what it wants.
Yeah, it wasn't a message to the Japanese. They were a defeated power. When they would come to end up on the USS Missouri was an open question. Maybe 6 months, maybe a year, but the outcome was known. I mean, we have another one of the great stories that loves, undergraduates are taught it all the time is when Truman was at Potsdam and Trinity was a success with the advent of the nuclear bomb, and how it was transferred to Truman, and how Truman broke the news to Stalin, and Stalin wasn't moved
Yeah.
because, of course, there was what was his name was Fuchs, right? I mean,
Fuchs,
one
yeah,
of
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
one of the
Klaus
spies
Fuchs,
that
yeah, yeah,
yes that in the Manhattan Project. So it was all about geopolitics. But at the same time, the Americans were I'm sorry, the Russians were very, or I should say Soviets were very pleased. No, let me say that again. The Americans were very pleased that the Soviets would come in on their side against the Japanese.
yep,
Okay,
right,
so yeah, I mean the Soviets did the grunt work of fighting a land war, not on sea, and so this was just a message. It was the advent of the opening up. They didn't call it the Cold War then, but it was the opening of salvos of the Cold War. As merciless and heartless and all of that. Sure, it's all fine, and I don't really disagree with it. Okay, but it was signaling a bipolar world, the
yes,
Soviet Union in its orbit and the Americans in their orbit. Okay,
right.
and the Americans were happy that the Soviets came in, but they weren't going to share Japan. No, no,
Oh,
no, 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 no.
well, the Soviet Union
Well,
got
the Soviets got, they got
they got Sakhalin,
Sakhalin, they got four islands, but
yeah, the
sure.
Kuril Islands. They got Port Arthur. They got Manchuria. They turned all this all all the weaponry that they captured in Manchuria. They turned it over to Mao Zedong. So they got they didn't walk away
Well,
empty-handed.
see, but that's the point, George. The Soviets got the better part of the
Right,
deal, okay? Because you have to remember that at Yalta and at Potsdam, Free China was an ally
right,
against the
right.
Axis powers, and they were sold out. They
Yeah,
were sold out.
right,
And again, that's why we have these alternative narratives that kind of cover up the insidious moralizing at the time. I mean,
right.
was that a good deal for the United States to give port? Yeah, well, yeah, they shortened the war. They actually wanted to save lives.
Well,
Okay.
that's right. And this was all offered to the Soviets at Yalta. This was all part
At
of the
Yalta.
negotiations. These were negotiations. The Soviets weren't going to enter the war for nothing. So the Americans had to promise the Soviets the things that they were going to get out of joining that war. But what's interesting is, this guy, one of the revisionist historians, is Gar Alperovitz, who wrote that book in the 1960s, in which he argued that the only reason the Americans used the atom bomb was to intimidate the Soviet Union. That was it. There wasn't really any need for it. But nonetheless, Alperovitz still insisted that it was the atom bomb, the use of the atom bomb, that caused the Japanese to surrender, and that's the false part of it, because
Well, no, George.
there's no evidence that
No,
that was the thing. Days went by after Hiroshima, and the Japanese still were not willing to surrender.
what empirical difference was there bouncing the rubble? I mean, Hiroshima stood out because it was a city that had not been firebombed during the course of the war. It was actually, and a lot of people in Japan moved to Hiroshima because it was seen as a safe city. And so no, but for Japan as a whole, it had been completely quarantined. There's nothing getting into the main islands.
Right.
Okay, as George and I have already said, they had no air presence
Yeah.
whatsoever. So the atomic weapons, as cruel and modern, if I can say, as they are, had no material impact on the Japanese war effort.
No,
None.
no, no, that's all. Because the Japanese knew that they had lost the war. However, they still believed that they had a certain amount of negotiating room, which is why they were cultivating Stalin. And they were thinking, well, at least, he could mediate. And so, yeah, we would surrender, but it wouldn't be unconditional. We'd still get something out of this war. The emperor would stay in power. Maybe even we'll get to keep some of our booty that we had gained during the war. I mean,
Which was considerable. Which
yeah,
was
it was
considerable.
considerable, and so and I think that was very important to the Japanese, that they still thought that we have some time on our hands, because this invasion, this American invasion, that is that's a big project, and it's really questionable whether the Americans were willing to sustain that level of casualties to invade
I
the island.
my father was at Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and considering the punishment that the Japanese rendered to American forces, and these are specks, these are just rocks in the ocean. Yeah, it was the Soviets that took the edge off for the Americans.
Right,
It wasn't atomic
right,
weapons.
right.
I know everybody likes to talk about it. It's simply there's no evidence for it.
No,
If
there's
you
no
look
evidence.
how the Japanese were thinking, the archives show this.
Yeah.
When the Soviets went to war, ended the neutrality pact, they knew it was over. It wasn't atomic
Right.
weapons.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. But what's also amusing, of course, the Americans wanted to retain. They say, "Hey, we did it. And I still absolutely America insists it was the atom bomb. We're the ones who dropped that, and the Japanese sued for peace immediately afterwards. That's the American position. Has been all 80 years. Interesting. The Japanese are also very happy to put that story out because, in a way, it absolves them of any blame. I mean,
Exactly.
they had
George,
waged a
George,
catastrophic, yeah, they waged a catastrophic war for all these years, and instead of acknowledging, these terrible, disastrous decisions that the Japanese leaders had made, the war was, hey, we got beaten because these barbarians used this wonder weapon. I mean, what could we do? I mean, we had to surrender.
if you look at the historiography, and it's a fascinating well, it's not even you can't even compare actually. If you look at German historiography, which the Germans have dug deep into the archives, the war guilds, war crime, all that they were on board with it up until about 15 minutes ago when it comes to Ukraine, but that's a different subject. The Japanese, the war started on the bombing, the atomic bombing
Right,
of Hiroshima, and it ended
right.
with the bombing of Nagasaki. That's the sick history
That's
of the Second World War.
that's right.
The Japanese won't let it go. They won't.
No, 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 no. And they present, so they can present themselves as victims,
Victims.
and and then everything else that they did. I mean, primarily making that idiotic decision to attack the Americans of Pearl Harbor was a really stupid thing to do. And then continuing this war, these were really bad decisions. And but then all of that is just wiped away and say, "Hey, what could we do? We're just helpless victims. These are barbarians."
Yeah, but it's interesting too. It's pointed out every single year, and it was pointed out this year. The solemn ceremonies at Hiroshima, where they have the museum and they have Ground Zero and all of that, there was still no overt statement that the United States did this. It was just these bombs blew
Right.
up.
That's right.
Okay, and the Japanese can live with that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. So they had this interest in minimizing the significance of the entrance of the Soviet Union and the Red Army into the war. They minimized it. The Americans obviously wanted to minimize it because they wanted to grab the glory for themselves. Yeah, yeah, we wiped the floor with the Japanese and say, hey, look at how tough we are. And everyone, and in the Cold War, everyone said, "Well, of course, Soviets didn't have anything to do with that." So it was a very convenient
The
But
Soviets had
the
nothing.
record is here.
The Soviets had nothing to do with that.
Exactly.
That's what this is all about, everyone.
Exactly.
And you have to think about the strategic planners. I mean, there was a book review a couple years ago in antiwar.com. I wish I can remember the title of the book that was reviewed, but there were strategic planners uh, um, um, envisioning the American century after the Second World War, and all we could do a separate podcast, the origins of the Cold War. There's a lot of nodes that you can look at,
Right.
but Japan was going to be on the American
Yeah. Yeah.
ledger. It
Yeah.
wasn't going to be split.
No.
It wasn't going to be neutral. It was going to be on the American side of the ledger, not the Soviet side. That
Right.
was the strategic.
Yeah.
When Americans thought strategically, okay, that was
Right.
the thought.
Right. No, I mean that's right. But of course, um, if the Red Army invasion had taken place, then at the very least, the Russians would have taken a good chunk of Japan for themselves, and Japan would have been as divided as Germany all the way through
Look,
the Cold
everybody,
War.
if there had been an amphibious invasion of the main islands, Stalin would have said, it has to be worth my time and
Oh
effort." And
yeah,
right, they
yeah.
would, 50-50 sounds kind of fair
I
to
think
me.
so. Yeah,
As a matter of fact, because I mean, obviously, Japan is closer to at that time the Soviet Union than any
yeah.
American. The Soviets, at great cost, I would probably imagine, but they would have made it worth their while. They're not going to just say, we want a port. No.
No, no,
Okay.
no. That would have been, well, they were already on Sakhalin. I mean, they were already landed. So the Japan's leaders now said, "Hey, this army, they could be here really within days. I mean, we don't have the window of a few months to think about and negotiate. This could be in a matter of a few days. They could be here in Tokyo." So they got really very, very anxious, and so that's when they said, "Okay, unconditional surrender." And that was the major decision. And in a way, it's just you grow up with this, and it's been the most accepted folklore about World War II. It was Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Japanese said, "Okay, that's it, boys. We're out of here." Even though the documentary record absolutely doesn't bear this out, and common sense doesn't bear it out, because it's clear the Japanese leaders really were not that perturbed about civilian lives. They'd lived for months and
What,
months
George? I
with
mean,
total destruction of their cities.
I'm trying to I know I don't want anybody to hold me to it, but I mean there was one firebombing mission of Tokyo that over 100,000
Yeah,
people died in one night.
yeah, that's right.
In
That's right.
one night.
That's right.
Okay, so dispelling the myths. It's a myth that the Japanese have gone along with. That's why it actually works, I think.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And it is this narrative has actually worked out very much to the benefit of the United States because Japan, with certain specific exceptions, pretty much goes along with what the
Yep.
U.S. foreign policy wants. That
Yep.
was the victory in the Pacific for the
Yep.
United States, is
That's
putting Japan on their side of the ledger.
That's right. That's right. That was the big victory, and it's a curious thing that the Japanese now are very hostile. These days they're very hostile to the Soviet Union, even though throughout the war, they maintained neutrality. That was 1941 through to 1945. They maintained this non-aggression pact. And given also the great Axis powers of Japan, Germany, and Italy, Japan didn't do anything for Germany. Didn't raise a finger to help
Well,
Germany.
it's one of those another oddities is why did Hitler declare war on the United States? He didn't have to, okay, and why did the Germans and the Italians think that Japan would add to their war effort? Okay,
No,
so.
yeah. I mean, I would think. I mean, and it's in a way speculative. Hitler declared war on the United States in order to buck Japan up, to provide some reinforcement, because he wanted Japan and the United States to be preoccupied with fighting each other for a few years. So the United States, that prevents the Americans from getting involved in Europe. And therefore he kind of wanted to encourage the Japanese. I don't think Hitler thought that highly of the Japanese. He probably didn't think that they could defeat the United States, but he wanted to give them some encouragement. Hey, I'm with you, because he never really reproached the Japanese. Hey, can't you do a little bit to help us? Open up a new front. It wouldn't have made any difference, even if Japan had opened up a new front, because Stalin knew the main front is here in the West against Hitler. Whatever the Japanese do, we can deal with that later. But
Well, all the more so.
this was where the war was.
Didn't lift really a finger because the Japanese were going after the great colonial
Yeah,
powers, the Dutch, the French,
yeah,
particularly the British. I
yeah.
mean, I should be careful with my words here, but I mean, some of the most humiliating military outcomes in the
Right.
history of the British military happened during the Second World War.
Well, yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, they did, and it was something that were that some British statesmen in the 1930s knew that this empire is not sustainable unless we try to maintain good relations with Japan, because ultimately, if the Japanese decide they're going to take our empire away from us, there's not a great deal we're going to be able to do about it.
And there was nothing they could do about it. It was absolutely humiliating what happened. I mean, go to YouTube, look at some of the film archives. I mean, you have these British commanders, I mean, generals, saluting
Yeah.
their Japanese masters and all that. It's
Right.
really humiliating for them. But if since George and I are just history wonks here, during the Treaty of Versailles, the Japanese wanted to have, equality of the
Yeah,
races.
yeah, yeah.
And oh, no, no, no,
No, no,
no.
no,
Yellow man. No, no, no. Even though they were an ally during the
right,
First World
right. But I mean, then there was the naval treaty. They at least got a piece of that. When they
War. Yeah, but a
capitulated.
piece. A
Yeah,
piece.
they got some of that. But ultimately, as things deteriorated in the 1930s in relation to Japan, particularly after Japan's invasion of Manchuria and the sanctions that were imposed against Japan, that's from then on it was it was all downhill all the way. But smarter statesmen like Neville Chamberlain said these sanctions policy are idiotic. We want to have good relations with Japan. What the hell do we care about Manchuria? We have to have good relations with Japan. But as always,
Well,
the
and,
more
and, and
stupid people
they
prevailed.
only here are you going to hear things about Neville Chamberlain.
Right.
George is absolutely right. And the condemnation of Japan when it came to Manchuria ended the League of Nations. I mean, Japan walked out. I mean, close the door, turn off the lights.
Right.
Okay. And Neville Chamberlain was absolutely right. Well, what does Manchuria have to do
That's
with it?
exactly.
Particularly since we're so vulnerable in the Pacific.
Vulnerable. That's what he said. We are a rich but vulnerable empire, and we have to think in those terms. If we want to stay rich, then we're going to make sure that we don't enhance our vulnerability. And of course, but the war, the Churchills and others, they were doing everything to enhance their vulnerability, and so it laid the foundation ultimately for Japan's attack on the British Empire. So
And it
foolish
also,
policy.
if you look at the strategic thinking coming out of the Roosevelt administration, keep in mind, everyone, yes, this was a war against the Japanese Empire, yeah, but it was a war against all those empires in the
Oh
Pacific.
yeah.
It was a war against the British Empire.
Oh
It was a
yeah.
war against the French,
Yeah.
a war against the Dutch. I
Yeah.
mean, that's not never mentioned. I mean, for all of the failings of Franklin Roosevelt, he wasn't a very bright guy.
No.
Okay, not,
No.
not at all.
No.
Okay.
No.
I admire him because he was always willing to try something like pack the court.
Right.
Like,
Right. Right.
whatever. I mean, he just said, "Who cares? I have to do
But,
something."
I mean,
That's leadership. That's leadership.
look, if you come out of the war, as America did, in an enormously strong position, then hey, history's
Yeah.
going to praise you. You did it. I mean, however, whether you're intelligent or not intelligent doesn't matter. I mean,
Right.
America was enormously strengthened.
Roosevelt went to Tehran. He went to Yalta. And look at the footage that was, sanitized for the public. That man was on his deathbed.
Yeah.
George, where's one capital he didn't visit during the Second World War? He didn't go to London. And he was asked over and over again by Churchill, and he would not go there. Okay, because if you look at the papers of all of these, particularly Churchill and Roosevelt, Roosevelt was abhorred the British Empire,
Yeah,
and he was going to squeeze it,
yeah,
and he did.
that's
You
right.
have to remember that the war in the Pacific was against the American war in the Pacific was against all
Yeah,
empires.
yeah, 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 yeah. And lo and behold, after World War II, the Europeans gave up their empires under American pressure. The Americans were pressing them, hey, you want this Cold War alliance, you want to be part of this anti-Soviet bloc, you want NATO, you better play ball with us because we're not going to bankroll the European empires. And so, boom, within 15 years of the end of World War II, all the empires were gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'd have to spend quite a bit of time reading every single country in that 15-year period that got
Yeah.
independence from all of those empires. And like the Dutch that wouldn't give up, they were, oh, the Dutch were nasty colonizers, okay? Wherever they were, the Portuguese were merciless. You always think of the French and the British, everybody drinking tea or something like that. No, these people were brutal, very brutal. Okay. And the Americans didn't want to have anything to do with it. They had their own version, what they did to the Philippines, for
Oh, yeah,
example. There's a
yeah.
lot of hypocrisy here,
No, no,
everybody.
no, no.
They're
America.
against everyone else's empire, but not
No,
our
no, no,
empire.
no, no. The Americans are no. The last thing you ever want to think about is Americans were somehow humanitarian, as we said. The dropping of the atom bomb. They didn't think about it at all. And as you say, the Philippines, really, really, really brutal. But on the other hand, you have to acknowledge that if you're going to run an empire, which means you've only got a small number of people ruling over millions. Well, the only way you're going to be able to rule over millions is if you are absolutely ruthless, absolutely brutal, and terrify the population as to what you might do if they rebel. I mean, that's pretty much, that's the only way you can retain an empire. How do you rule over its Indian continent with just a tiny, tiny British presence? Well, you have to show yourself to be pretty ruthless when it comes to use of force.
Well, I mean, it was common knowledge how the Americans subdued the people of the Philippines.
Right.
Word got out, George. Don't mess with these
Yeah,
people. George is
exactly.
absolutely, we don't want them to do that to us.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So the whole history of the Pacific is very, very distorted. And I can remember as a very young man that the thesis that George and I just expounded upon was not popular at all. Oh, they didn't say conspiracy theorists, but that's what they meant. No, you're a kook. You're
Yeah,
a kook. Well, read the documents.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah.
So again, this is one of these we commemorate. We're not, and it's not an anniversary. I
No,
always
no,
get
no, exactly. We
real touchy
commemorate.
about that word. Yeah,
Yeah,
anniversary.
we
We're
commemorate.
commemorating
Yeah,
what happened, and that created the world that George and I were born into, and how that world is rapidly changing right now. It's a very important part of that history. Without a history, we don't have what we have today.
that's
So I don't want to sound mysterious or anything because we talk about. All
right.
right, this is Gaggle and Peter with Peter and George. We're on Locals, so please go to the locals. Go to the gaggle.locals.com. This is what day is it? It's
Wednesday.
Wednesday, and that means George is going to be live streaming tomorrow.
Exactly. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Please join me. And as you do so, you're thinking about these dogs. They get up, in a foul mood because they come, they check the tip jar, and they say, what do I need to get up for this? That's exactly. It's looking, yeah, tip jar, nothing going on here. I'm going straight back to bed. In order to, liven them up a little bit, put them in a slightly better mood, please, anything you've got, anything, any money lying around, not doing anything, straight into the tip jar, all of it. It's just you don't have any use for it, boom, into the tip jar. So we're very grateful for all of your help, friendship, and support. The more you're able to donate, the more of these videos we can make, the more we can improve the technology, and above all, we're going to give the dogs some reason to exist, some meaning to their lives. So that's the main thing. So remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.